Well, it's an interesting question, but I think it's a really hard one to answer because in many ways China is both a developed and a developing country. And the way that you think about this is, well, think about China as a huge country. And so the vast majority of Chinese people are poor. And they live in a poor country that they kind of interact with other poor citizens. And so in many ways, it is clear that China is a developing country, if we're going to use that terminology, because its people remain poor. And yet, because China is such a huge country, it is still the case that there are a huge number of rich people in China. In fact, there are kind of more rich people in China than there are people in the United Kingdom. And so in that way, it is clear that if the United Kingdom is a developed country, then China has more people kind of at that level of income than a rich country might. And so in this way, it's really important to think about kind of the complexities of the question, that China is a complicated place with lots of different places and people with different levels of income, different kind of life experiences. And in this way, China is both, at some level, contains a small developed country inside of it, lots of rich population, but at the same time, the vast majority of its populace is a poor country. And in fact, if you look at the average income per capita in China, it is certainly among countries that you kind of would think of as a developing as opposed to a developed country. China certainly uses the rhetoric of calling itself a developing country without question. And yet it calls itself often a big developing country or a special developing country. And so I think that the kind of important way to think about it is that the Chinese government, the Chinese people think of themselves as living in a poor country because they see the poverty of many of their citizens. They realize that this is not a rich country by any means. And yet they also appreciate the fact that they are allowed to call themselves a developing country because it helps them get away with some things. That it gives them the ability to excuse behavior, excuse the poverty of some of its citizens, and it kind of really helps rhetorically when dealing with rich countries as to why is China not going to aid at the same level that other rich countries might. It gives itself this rhetorical power to say that, well, it's still a developing country. It is not yet at the level of economic development as a rich country might. And so it has this rhetorical power. In many ways, I think that we might need to move beyond this language of developing and developed countries, and that China is a good way to kind of point out the problems with this idea. Because again, there are both a developing and a developed country inside of China. So to think about this as a distinction where we can draw a line between rich countries or poor countries or developed countries or developing countries, I think it obfuscates more than it actually clarifies. And there are lots of ways of thinking about kind of more objective ways of language. So we could talk about high-income countries versus low-income countries. The World Bank talks about separating the populace of countries into lower middle, upper middle, and high-income countries, which is kind of very bureaucratic, but I think actually is kind of more objective. Whereas this language of developing versus developed has this problem of where do you draw a line, and are you going to draw such a sharp line between kind of all countries below something and all countries above? It just seems wrong. I think it also implies something about the developed world that I think is not true. That is that it is somehow done politically, that there is kind of nothing, that there is some standard that poor countries should try to reach and that those developed countries have all the answers. And I think that kind of belief or kind of statement about the world is factually wrong, that there are still debates about the ways that rich countries should move and the policies that they should implement that really show that politics is not done in these places. It is certainly the case that a gradient or some type of kind of spectrum, that countries exist on spectrums in multiple dimensions, and income is a major one. And we think about power, we often think about the ability to buy things, because in our society, a capitalist society, that's power, is the ability to purchase things. And so income is one kind of piece of this, and it does exist on a spectrum that my income might be higher than yours or lower than someone else's. Similarly, China's average income per capita is lower than many countries and above others, and it does exist in this gradient. And so kind of a map of the world that exists kind of with richer countries, kind of more darkly colored than kind of poorer countries, or however you want to do it, I think does betray a much more, the complexity of the situation in a much more reasonable fashion than a simple binary between the developed and developing worlds. Again, I think there is something to be said for the rhetorical power that China kind of takes from the idea that it is a developing country. And in many ways, this can be seen in international negotiations about how much should China have to contribute, or should rich countries have to contribute, developed world versus the developing world. China is having problems in itself in trying to think about how it should engage other countries that are more poor than itself, and so is giving increasingly foreign aid and other types of distributions to countries that are even poorer. And yet there is some internal dissent to this because China remains an impoverished country and many of its citizens are poor themselves. And so why should China, a poor country, help other countries? And so I think that this idea of it does matter that China uses this power, this rhetorical power that comes from developing as opposed to developed. And yet I think that this can also be seen in climate change negotiations, where countries are kind of drawing a line between those who have benefited from industrialization and have released carbon for decades or generations, as opposed to those who have not yet industrialized. And so this line between the developed and developing is associated with, in the climate change negotiations between NX1 and non-NX1 countries. And so this language of a dichotomy between developed and developing can be seen as kind of influencing international negotiations, even though I think it doesn't help and actually harms our understanding of the realities. I think that Chinese politicians understand and appreciate that this developing country status that they claim has advantages in building coalitions with other poor countries around the world. At the same time, I think there are real questions as to how a developing country can operate as a superpower. And so I think that Chinese politicians are kind of walking a fine line between the idea of, well, we're a powerful country, but we're a poor country. They're kind of building islands in the South China Sea, which not a lot of developing countries are trying to do. There are a lot of kind of issues with this language and with this idea of China and where its status is in the world. And I think that it's a tough problem, and I think you will see a change in the language that the Chinese government uses as it continues to economically develop, because it will become increasingly clear that it is a different kind of country than the countries that we refer to as developing.